one of the things that we talk about a lot is thinking about code being a liability. And so that's where we were so excited about AWS, because they're writing and battle testing all of this code that we don't have to. And in the DevGraph side, we're focusing on developer tooling based on AWS as the platform. So thinking about AWS, that they've done that all over the entire computing space, and so we think this is the platform that we want to build on, and so we just want to make that easier to use. We've got CloudFix, and we're really excited about CloudFix. 40,000 different AWS accounts, and so we had to write some automation and tools to keep costs under control. Our long run goal, as I think about it, I want to be the car talk of AWS, where people can just ask questions and we can think, okay, what's your particular setup, and be able to just give advice that is backed by a lot of hard-won experience.
Please join me in welcoming Stephen Barr, Chief Evangelist at DevGraph to the show. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you, John, for having me. Really happy to be here.
So, Stephen, we got connected through a mutual friend, and we started talking about DevGraph and what you guys do and what you're trying to do throughout the community. Let's first talk about you, and then let's dive into DevGraph. Who is Stephen?
All right, well, let's see. I am the oldest of 5 kids. Let's see, my parents, Jeff and Carmen. Let's see, I'm married. I have 4 beautiful kids. Let's see, I've been in tech for as long as I can remember. And yeah, really enthusiastic about just technology, where it can take us, the promise of it. My first exposure to science fiction was Arthur C. Clarke and my dad's collection of, I started with 2001: A Space Odyssey and kind of read as much as I could about Arthur C. Clarke, and it just got me so excited on what technology can do, where it can go. Yeah, so I've been in technology basically my whole life.
I like it. Also like the Lego collection back there. So,
oh, thanks. I was telling you earlier, we used to have the original Lego monorail, and that was my favorite set. I really enjoyed that one. That one has vanished throughout the garage sales of history, but I hope someone's enjoying it somewhere.
Are you sure it vanished, or it just isn't hidden, so one day it'll come back to you?
I hope. I've seen these YouTube videos where the people will buy their dad's favorite long lost car that he sold to propose. I think maybe that'll show up with the monorail.
Anybody out there watching this video, if you happen to have bought the monorail from one of the garage sales that happened with Jeff and Carmen, or maybe Stephen was around and he didn't know it, please give him a shout out. He has a little nostalgia for it. He would like it to see it again, maybe.
I think Potomac, Maryland, circa 1992.
Now that's a good location for it. All right, so Stephen, let's dive into it. What is DevGraph?
Let's see. What is DevGraph? Okay, so DevGraph is part of a larger family of companies. There's a larger company called ESW Capital, and we have DevGraph, we have Aria, we have DevFactory, and those companies have been about, just what they do is that they acquire or build other technology companies, and then they make them more efficient, more operational, and then package them up into, depending on the client base. So DevGraph, we're focusing on developer tooling. We have the Aria brand, which is all about kind of enterprise IT and cloud adoption. So yeah, and in the DevGraph side, we're focusing on developer tooling based on AWS as the platform.
Okay, so in Aria, it's more geared towards the IT, and then DevGraph is geared towards the developer and the tooling. When you say developer and tooling, can you be a little more specific? What type of tooling are you talking about?
So one that we have called DevSpaces, and that is a cloud-based IDE. It will run on the AWS Graviton. It's based on Gitpod, and also, it runs VS Code. You can go to a Git repository. You can click on DevSpaces, and it'll launch a web-based development environment from that exact point in your repository. So say if you're on a certain branch, you just click the DevSpaces button on that branch and it will launch a fresh development environment for you. And I guess the cool thing is, it's totally isolated from everything else on your system. So instead of trying to manage Docker containers and different bash scripts with different environment variables to set up, okay, I'm working in dev, or I'm working in prod, or I'm working in test, you can have that totally isolated for you without all of the, I guess the ergonomics of doing it without DevSpaces become a bit cumbersome.
I imagine you'd have to set up your own environment, your own isolation and configuration. With DevSpaces, it's more of a virtual but global collaboration environment, allowing you to test and kind of play around. Walk me through the process of getting started with like DevSpaces. I click the button and it launches in my AWS account. It launches within your environment. How does that work?
Okay, so on DevSpaces is hosted on AWS, but the way that you would see it is just as a SaaS platform. But it's good to know that it's running in a US-based AWS region. So what I like about that, now I used to live in rural Australia. We didn't have the best internet connection. So when I was using DevSpaces, and say you're doing, you launch this development environment, it's running in the cloud, and you do an npm build, right? Well, without that, all of those packages are coming from onto your personal internet connection, which can be quite limited, especially over there. So being able to do that all within AWS and then running on AWS hardware. So sorry, that was a bit roundabout way of saying it. So you hit the DevSpaces button, it will clone your repository, it will launch a fresh development environment, it will start up a web-based VS Code, and it'll hand you back a web-based VS Code in a couple of seconds, and that has your code right there. You have to authorize it with GitHub because it could read your repositories. And you can also set it up to have environment variables built in, like your AWS keys. So I have different projects in GitHub that have different AWS credentials associated with them. And I know that when I launch that dev space, I know exactly what credentials it's launching with. I know what environment variable it has access to. It can't have other, if I'm switching back and forth through lots of different projects, it can be very easy to not switch your AWS keys and deploy something into the wrong place. Like, why can't I see this S3 bucket? Oh, wait, I'm in the wrong context.
I didn't specify the profile I'm supposed to use because I was incorrectly in it. I forgot all about it throughout the command. I can see that can be cumbersome and not understanding where you deploy things out.
Yeah, and then also just not having to manage Docker. Like Docker would be one way of doing this, where you can encapsulate all your dependencies into one place, but then getting every developer on board with that, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But this will do all of that behind the scenes. So it's based on Docker and Kubernetes, but it's all, you start DevSpaces and you're actually inside of a Docker container running on a Kubernetes cluster, but you're not worried about all of that mechanics. You can just focus on the project at hand. Like, as one example use case, we've had customers who they have the whole project in a mono repo, and they've got maybe an older version of Ruby, and they've got a lot of different dependencies, and they have this whole onboarding process that can be really difficult to get set up. And maybe they just want to bring in, say, a contracted designer just to modify some CSS. Well, talking them through, okay, how do you actually get everything set up so you can test their website locally? That can be an onerous process. So being able to just say, click this button and it's all set up, and then they can iterate on it on their own. That's really powerful.
Actually, that's really cool how quickly you can get set up and deployed, because if you think about a developer who's coming in, you're hiring a contractor or somebody else, right? And you bring them in and you say, all right, listen, here's what I want to do. Now it's going to take them like 2 weeks, 3 weeks just to get set up, get their laptop set up, get everything configured. By the time you onboard them, you could have done the work yourself, or at least kind of move some things around. Now you made it easy as a click of a button to deploy out everything, including all the dependencies, but with the speed and agility, utilizing AWS and, within the US region, but you're not doing it locally. So they can be globally, but everything's doing it locally within like the US. So now you're pulling everything down rather quickly.
You really nailed it in terms of that tension inside of like, I could do this myself, and do I really want to spend all this time? And that's a dangerous way of thinking, right? Because you have to learn how to delegate. That's an important skill.
Yeah.
But then it's really easy to, if there's a huge fixed cost associated with bringing other people, you're just not going to do it. So being able to just say, here you go, you click on this button and you're in the repository, and you have all the startup scripts and everything's just ready to go. It's really useful. And also just in terms of architecture. So we run on, like I said, we run on x86 or on ARM on the Graviton. And that way you don't have to deal with, who has access to what. Right? Like if your developers happen to have a Linux ThinkPad, they're not going to be able to test ARM specific things. And then vice versa. A lot of developers have M1 Macs, they won't be able to test x86 things. Actually, funny, it reminds me of this. There's one place where I worked a while ago, and we spent a bit of time fixing a Mac specific bug. And it had nothing to do with, we didn't have any Macs in production. We were all deploying to Amazon Linux too, but it affected development, and enough people had to deal with it. We had to spend time fixing it. And so it's things like that where we really don't want to have to be dealing with that.
So it really made it hardware agnostic, and you're running on either x86, the ARM technology, Graviton. Why Graviton or ARM?
Well, that's another. We're big proponents of Graviton. Well, it's cheaper. It's cheaper. AWS designed silicon. From a power perspective, it's really neat. They run a lot cooler than ARM-based chips. Or that's why your iPhone can have great battery life and not burn a hole in your pocket, right? Because it doesn't take as much power. So the Graviton is AWS designed silicon. They're rolling it out quite extensively to other different regions, and we really believe in it for most applications. And also Graviton is running a lot of the managed services, like there's Graviton based RDS and Elasticache. So if you're using a managed service, you really shouldn't care what's the underlying architecture, right? That should be abstracted away from you.
So basically, this is you're shifting left, utilizing AWS managed services, and I hate to use the term, but it's really taking the heavy footprint off of you and the burden of kind of managing the environment and just utilizing the services that are available. How are you making AWS easy?
Well, I guess there's a lot there. So I'll start with
it's a loaded question. I know you have so much of the thing, but we're going to get into so much to talk about. That's why I asked it.
Okay, cool. Okay, well, I guess staying with the development environment for a while. So we don't have to worry about matching your dev environment and your prod environment. So you're probably deploying to AWS, but then dealing with the difference between, okay, I hope my laptop, my personal environment matches the environment I'm going to deploy to. Well, there's a lot of room for error in that. I mean, I think our stacks are getting so enormously big, and there's just a difference, right? When a lot of people work on Mac OS or Windows or their own personal flavor of Linux that they're using, it's probably different than where you're deploying to. So if you're deploying to AWS, you might as well work on an environment that's as close to that as you can. And so DevSpaces helps you work in an environment that's a lot more similar to your production environment. So that's one way. Another way we make AWS easier, we're working on another product called DevFlows, which is a more no-code, low-code solution for wiring things together. Like you can have an S3 bucket and say you want to drag that into recognition and say, okay, when a file shows up in this S3 bucket and it has a .mp4 extension, then drop it into recognition, and then take the output of that, filter it, and maybe create a ticket in Jira or something like that. So we're making that's still in progress, and that will go through the Aria brand. And then also we've got our AWS Made Easy live stream, where Raul and I sit and talk about AWS, the latest announcements, and try and just sort through it all, because there's so much. And it takes a lot of time to figure out, well, what's relevant, what's important, what should I take from this? And we want to be a resource. Do you remember the audio show Car Talk?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I think our long run goal, as I think about it, I want to be the Car Talk of AWS, where people can just ask questions and we can think, okay, what's your particular setup, and be able to just give advice that is backed by a lot of hard-won experience.
I like that. Let's talk about DevFlow, and then I want to talk about what you guys are doing with regards to AWS and how they're releasing and how to filter through some of that data. So with DevFlow, it sounds like more of a maybe like a pipeline or a rule set or a step function to do certain actions, or is there more to it? Like, how does it work?
Well, I guess one way of comparing it, so it has a graphical interface, and you can drag on these adapters that represent AWS services, and you can think of it as a directed acyclic graph. That's kind of the data model, where you have something that will trigger it, like an S3 bucket, or you can set up a webhook to trigger it, and then you basically drag and drop these icons that represent different AWS services, and then the links between the icons, the edges, you have an opportunity to do data transforms and also filters, and then we will take care of turning that into a deployment on AWS. And so the idea is for teams who may not be comfortable writing a big CloudFormation template and writing all the code themselves. Here's one way of connecting all these pieces, but it's not a black box. You can see all the different pieces. You know which AWS accounts they're going into. There's no proprietary hidden services under the hood. We're just helping you connect things that are already there.
Okay, wait, Steven, we got to talk after this show. I just had this idea because right now I take a lot of my, podcasts and I will convert them to transcripts. I would love to do some drag and drop. To me, I don't want to have to write new code to do things and how to transcribe it. I would love to just drop the file right into S3 and, kind of tie everything together, go transcribe, and then it's back into the S3. And this no code that I had to put together, it's almost like a Zapier type thing. By the way, Zapier is not a sponsor, but I just want to kind of flow through it. Is that you're moving things around and you don't have to write code to it.
So that's the exact. That's a great analogy, and I like Zapier a lot. It's and we think about it as that, but it's AWS native.
Yeah. I think that is awesome, by the way, what you guys are trying to do. I got to test this out. I know you're still working on it, but I have some ideas for some things that I am doing as not only a podcaster, but, daily in the AWS, some cost things. You can do some certain functions.
Well, definitely we'll talk about that. So one of the things that I've got going for our live stream, so we have a flow that and I've tested this out with both the dev flow and just writing it out in code based on a Lambda function. But when we get the transcript and that transcript goes into an S3 bucket, we'll then, run comprehend on it, get the tags, extract the tags that are entities, and then match them up to AWS entities. So we know when we go through a show, we know all the different AWS entities that we talked about in that show. And then later I could say, give me all the episodes where we talked about DynamoDB.
I like that. Oh my God. So I can see that and utilizing it and picking out all the AWS services. And now you can filter these off of your website or a library of stuff. And okay, here's all the tags associated with that service. I want to learn more. You know what? You should go to DevGraph and take a look and just run this. And now you'll be able to pull out all the information on where the talks they had.
Yeah, well, I'll have that in the public pretty soon. I'm working on a live stream automation repository that shows a lot of the different services that we use. We use comprehend. We use the other thing that we do with our live stream is, so when we're planning out the segments, I say, we're going to talk about 5 or 6 different articles from AWS. Well, I want to generate a little transition video. And so I use this non-AWS API called ShotStack, and it can take our generic transition video. It's like an 8-second little jingle and an animation of Raul and I, and it will inject the title of the article that we want to talk about. It'll inject it right into that video. And then I have that queued up. And then so when it's time to actually talk about that video, I cue that transition. And then within that video, there's a few seconds of no audio and no video. And recognition segment detection API will pick that up. And then later, when I drop the final recording into my S3 bucket, it'll trigger some automation, which will say, hey, here's all the time markers of the different segments you talked about. Because I found that was really time consuming. But why should I go through when AWS has recognition segment detection? They could do that for me.
Okay, I'm going to have to play around with that. I do that. I do a lot of that myself.
Well, I found it to be so, well, I guess what do you call it? Programmers are fundamentally lazy, right? So I thought, I really don't enjoy this part of it where I'm going back through and trying to figure out when did we switch from this article to that article. And so now that's all automated, where we use segment recognition detection to tell us, okay, when did we switch from this context to that context? And then that will create a bunch of tasks in my task list. Okay, here's all the different highlights that I want to then promote over the coming week.
Well, Stephen, I want to jump over to what you're doing around the live streams for AWS and kind of picking things out with Raul. How are you deciding what to talk about? AWS releases so much daily. How do you filtering through all the noise of what's relevant and what's not?
Well, I guess that a lot of that comes down to, well, we'll meet before the show and we'll look at all of the different announcements that have happened since the last show. And really, I guess it comes down to experience plus personal interest in terms of, okay, what's the most relevant to a general audience? Like sometimes features that will come out, which will only be relevant to a smaller audience. We'll try to pick features that are more generally relevant. And I guess also personal interest. If there's something that comes up about Graviton, we're definitely going to talk about that.
Are you going to talk about, oh, Graviton was released in this region, that region, or more specifically to enhancements to Graviton or a new release or upgrade to it?
Well, it's funny. Sometimes we have
how to pick that out because regions are always announced for new services being released.
Well, I guess sometimes we'll take one of those announcements and say, okay, we'll spend about 20% of the time talking about the actual thing. Right. Oh, yeah. Sao Paulo just got access to this new version of this. Okay, great. Let's talk about the broader context. This is really exciting. This thing is growing. We really like this. And we'll have a more general discussion for a few minutes. And then we'll loop back around and we'll say, okay, what do we think of this article? And one of the ways we kind of rate the discussions at the end. So we'll give it a 5 clouds out of 5 or 3.5 clouds out of 5. And we'll also say, does this add simplicity or complexity to your life? And so we'll give it a simplicity or complexity tag.
Wait, you do that live for each of the topics that you do, like out of clouds? That's nice. I was watching one of your live streams on LinkedIn the other day, but I never got to the cloud thing. I was off on another tangent. I was commenting on. I'm not sure if it was part of that or not.
Well, that was more of an interview. So when we do interviews, sometimes that we don't do that as much. So we have two basically different types of segments. One of them, we call it the What's New review, where we're talking about the new articles. And then sometimes we interview, and in this case, we were interviewing Marcos Ortiz, who he just started the Graviton weekly newsletter. So we just had a more general Graviton chat with him. But we did review one article together.
Now for a quick interruption. A huge shout out to our friends at Veeam for sponsoring this episode. Veeam Backup for AWS can easily protect all of your Amazon EC2 RDS and VPC data. Wait a second, they can protect my VPC data too? Yep, that's right. Simplify AWS backup and recovery while ensuring security and compliance. All right, now back to our episode.
He gave it a 5 clouds out of 5, which Raul is more conservative with his rankings. I'm kind of in the middle. But we were all happy about that one.
You know what? I'm gonna watch it. I'm gonna have to give you a shout out for the clouds. I like that idea. Do you pop up little clouds?
We do. We have a little overlay in StreamYard, and so once we come to a discussion, I'll push the button for that little overlay, and it'll pop up on the bottom.
You should have between the two of you. He pops up yours, you pop up yours, and it's a discussion like, all right, why did you give it? It's like you holding up the number.
Exactly. And usually what will hurt an article is if they don't have any examples. We always like good examples or screenshots. But it's a fun, it's I guess it anchors the discussion in terms of what we like. And we like things that are simple and relevant and easy to use.
So Stephen, what else are you doing around? I mean, you're doing the live streams. You have a YouTube channel. For those who are not aware of it, definitely check him out on YouTube. You can just type in the YouTube search, DevGraph. You'll find it. His episodes are growing, the number that are increasing. You're doing a great job. I mean, first of all, I love the thumbnails. I'm a big proponent of having fun during a podcast or a live stream, and the thumbnail has to kind of go in with it.
The one that I like the most, we just started a DevSpaces hackathon series, and I'm giving that a real kind of cyberpunk vibe. And so check out the intro to that. I really like that. My designer Alex, she's really good at putting these together. But we have this kind of cyberpunk car, and you know how it's driving in that, like driving into the distance with the neon grid, and it's avoiding Kubernetes and avoiding Docker and avoiding local installs. That it zooms into the distance with a triumphant DevSpaces with this cool like 80s cyberpunk music in the background. So I really like that.
Well, a good shout out to that. I'll share everybody a link in the description below.
Sure.
Stephen, talk to me a little bit more about DevGraph and some of the things you're doing. I know you have something called Codefix. What's that about?
So Codefix, we're still incubating that, but it will. The idea is for large code bases, we can pull in an enormous amount of code and basically every function in every commit over time, and then we can do some kind of semantic analysis on it to see, okay, where are hotspots in the code, where are things changing, what are the kind of seams in the code where you'd want to perhaps replace a native service with a managed service, that sort of thing. And that's still pretty early on, but we should update that with more context. But that's coming. And the folks over on the Trilogy University side of the organization, there's a lot of the young folks there who are doing some really incredible things and coming up with new ideas and implementing them in this platform.
So with Codefix, is there an idea of seeing repeatable code and then making it a more of a function and minimizing the number of lines in the code, inserting variables when needed, suggestions? Is it doing the work for you or just suggesting it?
I think it's just suggesting. But then again, this is still in development.
Yep.
In terms of what it'll end up being in its final form. And these things evolve over time, and with new ideas and new people looking at it and thinking, okay, I've got an idea. They're very open to adding new things and trying them out. So when it comes out in its final form, I'm not sure what it'll look like, but I'm excited for it.
I like that. Stephen, what is your long-term goal of DevGraph? I know you want to be the go-to, AWS person to having a talk show. I think that's really admirable to sit down and discuss all those things. But what's your long-term goal of DevGraph and the community, the involvement?
Well, I guess zooming out, we really like AWS as the platform or the operating system of the future. And just kind of almost getting a little bit nostalgic thinking about the computing we used to do, right? Where you're thinking about very low level things. And I remember in my first job I was working at an email hosting company when I was a teenager, and it was just me and this a good mentor of mine who'd retired from Microsoft in his mid 30s, and he started his email hosting company. And he said, you need to learn about networking, and you have to learn about and so at that point it was the Linux 2.2 kernel and IP chains. And my 15-year-old self knew that stuff in and out. But now thinking about, it was so complicated and convoluted, and now thinking about what you can do with security groups, right? That would take what you used to spend weeks trying to figure out, you can do in a few minutes with a few clicks. So thinking about AWS, that they've done that all over the entire computing space. And so we think this is the platform that we want to build on. And so we just want to make that easier to use for people and to offer tools that can make it easier. Like I said, on the software development side, that's DevSpaces or DevFlows as that matures, to be able to do low code cloud native deployments, and also just offer opinionated guidance and advice. Like it's the larger organization, they've dealt with so much code, both new code bases and also older code bases through acquisition or just through the passage of time. I think at one point they had 40,000 AWS accounts under management. And so they've written a lot of automation of how to handle that, how to understand that, and how to comprehend that. And so just being able to offer advice, perspective, and for our enterprise customers working on cloud integration, how do they even get started? What's the right technology to look at? Should they jump right into serverless? So being able to offer some advice that's been, I guess, matured over a lot of time working in the cloud.
So is it safe to say now AWS, for me, understanding when I got started, it was a lot easier because it had a limited number of services. Now it's like 210 plus, and understanding those, but you truly are making it easier for developers and engineers to get their hands on and utilize it and understand it better. because there's so much involved, this is kind of simplifying the process.
Yeah, it's really, it's a big part of it is just having that perspective. I used to be in academia, and when I was an undergrad, I was asking one of my professors, I said, "How do I know if this paper is good or not?" And he said, "Well, when you know that, you are a professor. That's how you know that." And I think about that with AWS, and not to say that we're professors of AWS, but being able to look at everything that's happening and then say, what path should I take? Where am I in my cloud journey, and what path should I take? That takes some experience and some time, and then DevGraph and then the larger organization, they've had a lot of experience with companies all through their process, and to be able to offer hopefully useful advice and good tooling to make it easier to be in the cloud.
There's a quote that Warner Vogel's always says, and I'll probably butcher it, but it's somewhere along there's no shortcut or compression algorithm for experience, right? And the experience that you guys are, and I probably butchered it, but sorry, Warner. But that's really what you're coming in with. And I think the experience of you working not only, as a young age on the mail server and everything you've done kind of helps you throughout the process of simplifying it for folks. I mean, don't you feel that knowledge has helped you today?
Oh, absolutely. I have lots of fun stories you can share. Yeah, just about things that have gone right, things that have gone wrong. Those really help to understand it, kind of clarify your purpose and your process. I'm happy to share any of those.
Yeah, actually, you know what? Why don't you share one of the stories, and you can pick it, one that didn't go right or didn't go right and then finally went right, or whatever you want. I enjoy stories on the show.
All right. So, okay. And I'm withholding names, but this is a long time ago now. But I was working with a very traditional company, and I guess the part of the story is about how do you find trusted expertise. And so I was working with this very traditional company, and they had this machine learning model that was supposed to predict certain customer needs so they can kind of preemptively fill those needs it was kind of a hardware and consumable combination. And so this organization had purchased this extremely expensive machine learning product, and they had tasked someone with implementing it. And somehow there was this communication breakdown in this process, and the person who was supposed to implement it, they couldn't figure out that the infrastructure wasn't set up for them to actually implement it, and their complaints weren't being heard. So they ended up kind of writing their own machine learning model, but they wrote it in a way that was a pile of about 1,200 stored procedures in SQL, because the only tool this person had at their disposal was SQL, and the greater organization couldn't grasp the fact that he needed access to things that were outside of SQL. So at some point he just threw up his hands and said, "Okay, I'm going to write this giant pile of stored procedures to implement this machine learning model." And he did, and I was brought in to calibrate the model and tune the model. And it turns out they weren't using that expensive product at all. They were just using this guy's giant stack of stored procedures, and no one knew about it. And so I guess the point is they didn't have trusted expertise. They didn't have great communication. So it led to this really strange situation where this expensive software that they thought they were using, they weren't actually even using it. And when their database started getting slower and slower and slower, they didn't understand. And then I was digging in there as a young consultant trying to figure out, and I had to have some strange phone calls after that one.
I can imagine the phone call. Yeah, I came to tune the system. It's not being used. In fact, it's still brand new out of the box.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a strange one. But I guess what I really appreciated in that perspective was it was hard for them to access advice that was useful to them, and they didn't know how to screen for it. And so I guess being able to say, okay, we have got a lot of experience with AWS, demonstrable experience, and we can give you good advice and good guidance and good tooling, so you don't go down this garden path that then later will take a lot of work to get out of.
And DevGraph, AWS trusted developers. Developers for AWS trusted. I think you get, I'm trying to come up with a new slogan for you. I think the way you come across, I think you genuinely want to help folks, within their environments, within the developers, and create something that makes it easier for them, and listening to them, really being like customer obsessed. And that's, one of AWS's core values, and you're following suit with that and creating and working with customers and making things really easy for them.
Yeah, that's a great summary. We want to make it easier for people to use AWS, to build on it. I mean, I think it's the coolest thing, right? Thinking about, this sounds kind of funny, but like when I think about science fiction and I see some robot who's, looking at the world, I say, are they running recognition v3? Is that what's happening in there? Like you start to think at some point our reality is going to catch up to what we're seeing on this screen, and there's going to be, code and functions that are going to have to make that possible. And maybe we're seeing the beginnings of them, right now. And so
I think we
to be
are
part of it.
Yep. No, you guys are a big part of something huge. So, Stephen, before we wrap things up, is there anything else you'd like to talk about around DevGraph or leave the audience with?
Well, we've got CloudFix, and we're really excited about CloudFix. So I said earlier, the organization had at one point 40,000 different AWS accounts, and so we had to write some automation and tools to keep costs under control. And so that was really, so they developed CloudFix. And the idea is, okay, what are some very simple, no impact fixes that can be deployed in order to, to save money. And and CloudFix will never say, oh yeah, re-architect the whole thing. They're saying things like, switch your EBS volumes from GPT-2 to GPT-3. There's no reason why you wouldn't want to do that. That's just essentially like an arbitrage in terms of cost savings. But it's not the default path. So CloudFix can scan your AWS account. We know a bunch of things to look for, and then it'll generate a change manager change set for you and say, okay, here's the change that we think you should do. This is how much we're going to think. This is how much it will save you if you do this. Do you want to click this button and go for it? And you can review it. And then if you want to, it'll start saving you money.
Stephen, I was hoping you'd talk about CloudFix, because I was a PSA for cloud management tools at AWS, and cost optimization is one of my key things. Like I have, I kind of geared towards it, and all the things that you're able to do impossible. Going GP2 to GP3 to me seems like a no-brainer. I mean, it's a win-win, not only faster, cheaper, but it's just one of the things. IO 1 to IO 2, there's like just so many things and possibilities that you can do. CloudFix, here's a question for you. CloudFix, can it scan? And you mentioned they have what, like 40,000 AWS accounts at once. Can CloudFix scan all my accounts?
Yeah, you can. You can give it. There's advice on the kind of credentials. We'll give it a read-only type of credential. It won't go in there and change things for you, but it'll generate a change set for you that then you can then look at and say, okay, do I want to deploy this change? And then you can, and it will save you money.
Talk to me about some of the other capabilities of CloudFix. What are some of the other things that it looks for, and how does it come up with these? Are these a manual implementation where you say, I want to look at one of, right sizing, or this is one thing I want to look at optimizing my Lambda function?
It will look at certain VPC configurations. And again, I'm not understanding the exact details of this particular part, but there's certain situations where data transfers can be enormously expensive, and it can say, hey, it can alert you to these things and say, this is a different way to configure it where you won't accumulate this type of charge.
Data transfers are huge and a hidden cost for a lot of folks because they can't visually see that or predict it. You can't go to the AWS cost calculator and say, let's predict my data transfer cost is going to happen, because your data is going to grow as quick as possible. But visualizing it using CloudFix will help you understand where a lot of your cost is going to, and maybe you can actually change some of your configuration in order to optimize the data transfer between VPCs or stay isolated within your AWS account.
Yeah, exactly. And so the people who are making CloudFix, what they do is they're always reading the AWS trusted the advisories, and they're looking for, okay, how do we automate finding this, and then how do we automate generating a change set to implement that? And so we're growing that library all the time, and we have every incentive to do that.
Nice. I like the AWS cost portion of it. And I think that's key being in a developer, because as a developer, you're not really focusing on the cost in general. And now this does go into like DevOps or cost DevOps, however you want to kind of put it into a perspective. But looking at and visualizing the cost that you're doing per environment and what you're deploying is actually key, where you're working bottom up and the financial person is not coming to you and say, hey, listen, I need to minimize costs. Now you're working in an operational model, not a CapEx model.
Yeah, exactly. And just kind of zooming out, right? You have to, we're really excited about all the things you can build on AWS, but that doesn't happen if you run out of money. So being able to,
That's
right,
a good way to put it.
Right. And so we're not going to be the ones who solve, I don't know, any one of the number of crises that we're facing, but code's going to solve that. And we want to make sure that those people's code can stay running and that those businesses can stay running so that they can do the good things that they're doing. Yeah. Okay. So I guess there's a name. The CloudFix is the one that's doing the cost scanning. Codefix will be looking at actual code bases, and that will be coming out. That's still in the experimental phase.
Yep. That's awesome. So
but I guess thinking about,
go ahead.
I guess one thing that I was thinking about when I was thinking about, okay, DevSpaces, I was looking at the state of the Octaverse report that GitHub puts out, and it all comes down to code bases that can quickly merge pull requests are the ones that evolve successfully. And so by being able to switch development environments and switch context quickly, that's where you can really iterate quickly. And so that's why where we see DevSpaces fitting in. Say if you have to look at a request that changes some dependency, and you're hesitant to do that on your local machine because you just got things set up right, you finally got virtual env doing what you wanted to, and someone says, hey, on this branch I've changed, I'm working on a changeover from say MySQL to Postgres, and on this branch, and this actually happened to me once, where I was doing 2 different code reviews and they were the same code base but branching in 2 different ways. And so it was really, I wish I'd had access to DevSpaces at that time, because I could just keep them separate. They're just different browser tabs. I don't have to deal with how do I look at the same code base twice on my same machine, but with totally different dependencies kind of underlying them. It felt like a bit of a Rube Goldberg. And so I didn't want to be, I'm glad that that's all automated away now. Just, start up 1 tab for this branch, 1 tab for this branch, and that's all you have to worry about.
Sounds like your speed to development or go to market for a lot of things where you're deploying it, testing it out, and now you can see like kind of a blue-green type model.
Yeah, and even things like experimenting on Graviton, right? So you can say if you're x86, you could just fire up your code on our Graviton environment and just see if it works, right? It's not this big difficult thing where you have to spin up an instance by hand and then set up your keys so it has access to your code. You could just try it.
Nice. I like it. It kind of simplifies the process. You're not worrying about the underlying infrastructure.
Yeah.
Nice. So Stephen, before I wrap it up, anything else you want to leave with the folks?
I guess one of the things that we talk about a lot is thinking about code being a liability. And so that's where we were so excited about AWS, is because they're writing and battle testing all of this code that we don't have to. And so I remember one of my colleagues, he just bought a new Mercedes, and he was repeating one of the talking points from the salespeople. He said, there's 18 million lines of code in this car with him. And, in my head as a developer, I'm like, oh, that's a lot that could go wrong. Yeah, no, and our car at the time was, completely mechanical. And there's actually an interesting story over in the Seattle area. There's 3 years of Mazdas, I think it's 2014 to 2017, where the local NPR station broadcasts some metadata, but there's something wrong in the metadata parser of the infotainment systems of Mazdas of this year, where they can actually get bricked over the air. And it's probably some stupid file name parser of the image of the radio station's logo, and just for this one brand of car and this code that's locked away and can't be replaced and can't be modified. And whoever wrote that, if they had access to some more general string parsing library that was written and battle tested at a 10,000 times the scale, maybe they wouldn't have run into that problem. So because zooming out, we see AWS as they're doing all of the core utility code that's just annoying to write, annoying to rewrite, putting up API endpoints and securing them and getting data into this place and out of this place. That code's been written a lot of times, but letting AWS do it, and then you can just know what's out there and build on it, and you can just do things so much faster.
You can focus on the outcome or the business application because AWS is handling the managed side of it and already doing a lot of that heavy lifting.
Yeah, exactly. We don't have to think about scaling and even some of these higher level things like recognition, right? Like I've built, tried to build, image processing things in my machine learning classes, and they're really hard to do well. But thinking, okay, recognition is a model that's been trained on more data than I'll ever have access to, and validated on more data than I'll ever have access to. So just use that. Don't try and do it yourself. And then focus on what can you do with recognition.
Also, I did not know that Mazda's that year could become a brick. I'm going to make sure I don't purchase it. No, I'm just kidding.
It's just the infotainment system. And I guess it's just it's one example of how this code, I don't know, how code can be a liability, right? Because every code that you write, it lives longer than you think it will.
Yep.
So just we try to minimize the amount of code that gets written and lean on AWS as heavily. And usually for a given business, right, the core value is in a really small amount of business logic that ties together things in a unique way. But then there's all this layers and layers and layers on top of it. And it's hard because, it was built over a lot of period of time, so you feel very attached to it. But at the end of the day, it's better to offload that to AWS and let them do that part, and you can focus on the core value part.
I think it's a real world use case on something that happened, because then you can take that, and if they took it and did what you recommend them to do ahead of time, the battle tested, don't have to worry about it. And these examples, these will be caught before actually going to production.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Stephen, thank you so much for joining the show. It's been a pleasure having you.
Oh, thank you for having me. And really appreciate it. Looking forward to seeing you at reInvent soon.
Oh, you know what? Before we wrap things up, I got to give a shout out to you. We are going to be at reInvent. Steven's going to be joining us in the hospitality suite that's happening. Live stream events, podcasts. Raul's going to be there as well. We're going to be talking about CloudFix and some of all the benefits, but what AWS is releasing. Steven, I can't wait to see you out there.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you, meeting you in person, and joining you in the hospitality suite. That's going to be great.
Yeah, it's going to be lots of fun. Everybody, Stephen Barr, Chief Evangelist at DevGraph. As always, my name's John Myer. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and notify, because guess what? We're out of here.
Thanks.
So, Stephen, can you share another story or an example you had when you were kind of going through it, maybe in graduate school or, kind of throughout your progression of your career?
Oh, okay. So one I can think of. I was working with this professor, and she was phenomenally bright, and she had this $20,000 GPU based computer, and she was doing these really neat finance simulations. And she had one simulation that it took her like a month of time on her desktop to run. And she was a programmer as a means to an end. But she wasn't involved in anything about cloud or anything like that. And this was quite a long time ago. And she submitted this paper for review, and it was heavily dependent on the simulation. And then she had a bit of a panic moment, and she said, "Stephen, is there any way we can rerun the simulation like over the weekend?" It took a month on my computer. And at this point, there were 6 regions in AWS, and our account was limited to 100 computers per region. And she was using this proprietary language called Gauss, which is like a competitor to MATLAB. Okay. And so she wrote this, her whole thing was just one long script in Gauss of running the same program on different inputs. And so I wrote this code really, really quickly to just put all the parameters in SQS, and then, really double checked my code, and then launched 100 EC2 instances in each region times 6 regions. We had 600 instances going, and all of them had a really simple loop, which is just pull from SQS, run the simulation, write the results out to a JSON file, push it to S3, and once the queue is empty, shut yourself down. And it worked. and we were able to validate the results of the simulation, and it was really fun. It was really neat to be able to. It was the first time I'd written a for loop that spent that much money, and but it worked. It validated the results of her simulation, and it kind of impressed on me, like, wow, this is. And I guess that's why grad school, I was so impressed with the tooling. I almost was distracted from the actual problem at hand, because like, wow, this is incredible. Like, yeah, the problem is interesting in and of itself, but look at what we could do. We could have a cluster of computers all across the world doing work for us that, you know, we've never seen, we'll never see, have nothing to do with their maintenance or anything. Just use it for what we needed to do, and then it was great. It worked.
Steven, I have 2 questions out of that. Were you able to accomplish it in the weekend time frame that she needed?
We did. Yeah. And I was already familiar with her code base because I'd written some static analysis code. And she was a really, really bright professor. And she wrote these like 2,000 or 3,000 line script with variables named EXYX and EYYX and EXXY. And she was able to keep it all straight in her head because they're all like, you know, derivatives of derivatives. But I wrote the static analysis code to kind of verify that it was all doing what we thought it was doing, because there was no tools for this language. It was a really small proprietary language. So I was familiar with her code and how to run it. But yeah, it worked. We met the weekend deadline.
Nice. My last one, you had 100 servers in 6 regions, 600 servers running. Any chance you know the cost of that?
That was her budget, but I think it was in the mid-thousands.
Hey, it was her budget and it worked for the project. As long as she came in under budget, I'm sure she was happy that it was done over the weekend. You probably actually kind of drove her to do this more often and got a bigger budget to do it, because now she didn't have to run it for a month and get the results. She had faster time to results to show her work.
Yeah, and I should reach out to her again. I've kind of lost touch since leaving that part of leaving that world. I'll reach out and see where she is. That's a good impetus to do that. Thanks.